It's something of a spring election season. Canberrans go to the poll this weekend and Queenslanders get their chance to cast a ballot next weekend. And the federal politicians are going to be watching very closely to see if there's anything in the electoral mood that might sway the timing or outcome of the next federal election, which is due to be held between now and mid-May. Queensland will be a key state in the federal election. It's one that Labor really needs to succeed in if it is to be able to stay in government and if it has any hope of staying in a majority. But things are changing at a state level. So I'm keen to take a look at what's happening in this state poll. We've got the Premier Stephen Miles trying to hang on and deliver Labor a fourth term, a full decade in power. But all the indications suggest that LNP leader David Crisafulli has come to spoil the party and take back power for the LNP. I'm Melissa Clarke on Ngunnawal Country at Parliament House in Canberra, filling in for David Speers. This is Insiders on Background. Now, when it comes to assessing moves in electorates, there's no one better to talk to than Samaras and Tony Barry from Redbridge Group. They know the ins and outs like no one else, and they're great friends of insiders. So, Tony, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Mel.
With this election in Queensland now only a week and a bit away, what data do we have to tell us how things are looking?
I think the polls are pretty static and I think they're not moved all that much. I don't think the campaign's actually impacted the most recent public polling that we've seen, which is the LNP sitting at about 55, obviously the LP at 45. There is definitely a class dynamic present in Queensland. So if you look at Brisbane, Labor seems to be doing really well and holding its own in electorates close to the Brisbane River. But then as you venture out, for example, further out into the outer suburbs of Brisbane, it gets pretty ugly for them. And obviously the regions are going to be really, really tough for them election night based on what we're seeing.
Yeah, Tony, tell us a bit about that divide in Queensland that comes from the southeast corner and what's happening in the rest of the state.
Yeah, it's a very fragmented vote pattern that we're seeing. We're going to see very different results from the urban seats, inner and middle suburbs, to the regions. Out of Brisbane is somewhere in between. But the further you get away from the CBD, the uglier it is for the ALP in broad terms. And we're going to sort of see, some pretty violent swings against the government in the regions. But even in the outer suburbs, there's fertile ground there in some of those seats like Aspley and so forth.
What is it that we think is driving this big change? Is it just its time factor, Labor's been in power so long, or some of these other issues that have cropped up in the campaign really biting? Youth crime, abortion, oddly enough, that wasn't on my bingo card, but that's been a big one. Do we have any data on qualitatively what is seeing this potentially very ugly result for Labor?
Well, Labor are fighting political gravity. It's a 9-year-old government asking for 13. So there's a lot of factors at play there. There isn't its time factor. But there's a lot of grievance in the electorate. It's a bad time to be an incumbent government anywhere, not just in Australia, but in a lot of parts of the Western world right now. And, we've done a lot of qualitative and quantitative research as to what's driving some of these numbers. And underpinning it all is this incredible sense of grievance and pessimism in the electorate. We did an MRP, which is a seat-by-seat poll this week, that was published, and we're asking people about, do you think standard living will be better or worse in the future? And talked about home ownership without family assistance. And those numbers were just total pessimism. And interestingly, in the context of Queensland, when you're looking at the bottom 10 seats of the 150 seats in the new parliament, Queensland were overrepresented in that bottom 10 in a lot of those key metrics. And the seat of Blair, the federal seat of Blair, was in the bottom 10 of all three. So I think that might be a smoky when the federal election rolls around.
Queensland's definitely got a sort of two-speed economy going on at the moment where, a lot of commentary we've seen over the last 6 months, pointing towards Queensland being economically well placed in terms of the rest of the country. It's clear that, if you live in the outer suburbs, places like Logan, Kingston, out in Ipswich, regional Queensland in particular, you're doing it really tough. And so a lot of the data that we're seeing suggests that the affordability crisis is really hitting Queenslanders in these parts of that state severely.
Perhaps that's why we're seeing the federal government put a lot of focus on cost of living measures, but so has Stephen Miles in the state campaign. There's been, very cheap public transport, energy rebates, much to the frustration of the federal government at times that's worried about inflation getting out of control. Do those measures, whether they're coming at state level or whether they're coming from the federal government with this flurry of announcements we've seen lately around supporting the ACCC to crack down on price gouging and the like, do those sort of things help shift the dial on that pessimistic sentiment?
I think, as Cos said, in public and private polling, we're not seeing a lot of movement. It's been pretty baked in now for quite some time. And Labor's internal polling, we're showing the same thing. And so consequently, they're throwing a lot of Hail Marys. Okay, they're trying to shake that primary vote a bit and trying to punch through to a higher primary vote. So they're throwing a lot of these Hail Marys, like, the 50-cent public transport, the free lunches for school kids, which is straight out of the Daniel Andrews playbook, which, probably worked for Daniel Andrews a few years ago when the economy was a little bit more optimistic. I'm not sure it's going to work out for him this time, but it's indicative of their approach to just trying to, shake some votes out of the tree.
Problem they have there is that most voters' response to that is, well, why didn't you do it over the last 2 or 3 years, particularly over the last 2 years when most of these Queenslanders were feeling the pinch and burning into their savings and having to make these sacrifices. So waiting until that election period to send a strong signal to the electorate that you're serious about helping them with the affordability crisis is probably a bit too late.
I wonder if you can give me a bit of a historical look at Queensland versus federal Labor. They seem to do better at different times over the years. We've had a very long run of Labor in power at a state level, but federally, Queensland's been a real difficulty for the federal ALP. What's the dynamic going on there, Cos?
Yeah, look, it's really the difference between how Labor at a state level performs when it comes to southeastern Queensland and particularly Brisbane. And versus how it performs, generally speaking, across the entire state at a federal level. And there's obviously a very significant difference, and Queenslanders obviously, particularly over the last 20 years, have shown a really strong tendency of favouring state Labor governments and voting significantly in favour of the coalition at a federal level.
I want to look at what this might mean for the federal government and the federal election coming up sometime in the next 6 months, because we had a news poll out at the start of this week and it didn't show much movement in primary and two-party preferred votes, but there was one small movement that definitely got a lot of attention, and that was seeing the coalition get ahead on a two-party preferred vote for the first time since the 2022 election. It mightn't be much of a move in the polls, but Tony, does that put a bit of a bounce in the step for the coalition? Is there a big psychological benefit of that kind of polling result being handed down?
Yeah, hugely. I mean, a lot of these public opinion polls, whilst we love them, it is scoreboard pressure to a certain extent. And when you're in government, particularly in your first term, and suddenly you're behind in the polls, it does start putting pressure on you, and you start looking for looking to sort of punch out of that problem. So and we're sort of seeing Labor sort of looking for answers, and that's when mistakes can happen. Where you sort of overreach on a policy, or you buy a $4.3 million beach house. These sort of errors that comes with that scoreboard pressure.
Yeah, that polling was done before it was revealed that Anthony Albanese had bought that $4.3 million clifftop home in the New South Wales Central Coast with his fiancée Jodie Hayden. Is that something that is likely to shift the dial in opinion polling? It certainly made a big splash, but are those sorts of, I guess, perhaps personal issues ones that can resonate through to voter sentiment? We
were in Melbourne's outer western suburbs last night, and in doing a focus group, and half the participants already knew about it, and let's just be diplomatic and say that they weren't impressed.
I'm sure there's plenty of policy announcements that have been made over the last couple of weeks that half of those people were not aware of.
Correct.
So that's the power of a story like this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Look, it would take normally weeks for something like that to be raised with us unprompted within a sort of focus group setting. But it didn't take. They were very much aware of it and were keen to talk about it too.
I want to ask a little bit more about this feeling of grievance that you've both mentioned, and I know that's something that Labor MPs are acutely aware of, especially those who are in seats where there's a population that is very concerned about what's happening in the Middle East in particular. Can you tell us what you're seeing in those areas, in particular, some parts of Western Sydney, some parts of inner and northwestern Melbourne? How is that sentiment affecting Labor at this point?
Yeah, it really is. Look, for Labor, they're caught on both sides. So with the Australian Muslim community, they've got a significant problem, and it's a continuation of what has been in place for some time. So this, the Gaza as an issue on its own is not the only reason they have now got problems in what was once their traditional safe seats, which they are now obviously very worried about. A lot of young millennial Gen Z Muslim Australians were already voting differently to their parents. And we got a bit of a preview into that in Victoria at the last federal and state elections, where Labor really did absorb significant swings against it in electorates where there were a high number of Muslim Australians present. Going on from that, the research we've done in this space, it's basically younger Muslim Australians who are choosing to vote for independence and choosing to actually behave electorally very different to their parents. So then throw Gaza on top, and yes, we've got a supercharged problem in play now, and that's just another front that the Albanese camp have to confront.
So let's put together the bigger picture there. We've got those issues that Labor's facing. We talked earlier about Queensland and the difficulty Labor has beyond the limits of Brisbane and the southeast corner in Queensland. Looking at those elements and others that you come across, Tony, what do you think a likely outcome of a federal election would be if it were held today? Would they be able to hang on for a majority in the current circumstances?
You'd say so, but there's still a long way to go. There's still a very narrow path to defeat for Albanese, but he's certainly walking that narrow path with surety and determination. And on the current trajectory, anything can happen over the next 6 months. It is a government that's ageing prematurely, and combined with the grievance in the electorate. What the RBA does in the next 6 months could have a very big effect and impact on the election result.
Yeah, I think we'll be waiting on the timing of some of those meetings. And look, just to round it out for the coalition, what's their pathway at this point? Do they need to wait for a government to lose an election, which is often the case federally? Or is there a way that they can harness this voter sentiment knowing that a poll's only a few months away?
Well, the electoral math is still very difficult to get to 76 seats. It most likely means making some inroads into the teal seats as well as the traditional Labor-Liberal contests. But you have to say Peter Dutton has been sort of playing, a very strategic game. And, he is making himself look electable, looking like a safe pair of hands, he's differentiating himself from Albanese on all the key attributes that people look for in leadership, including strength. And I think that is something, where if Dutton can show a few more policies to sort of be tapping into that home ownership debate, then he could be, he could pull off a surprise victory.
Do you think that's not out of the realms of possibility? What is it, 16 seats that they would need to pick up for that victory?
Yeah, well, if you're talking about seats like Aston that was lost in the by-election, then which is sort of a notionally a Liberal seat after redistributions that have all occurred. So it's not sort of quite like for like, but there's still there's a lot of seats to be picked up, and the electoral math is difficult. There's no doubt about it, but. As I said, Albanese's got a narrow path to defeat, and he's certainly, heading in that right direction.
He may also have a narrow path to defeat, but the number of seats the Labor government's going to have to defend is probably going to reach record levels. So they've got a problem with the traditional Liberal versus Labor contests, and those seats are now largely in the outer suburbs and regions. They obviously have a problem versus the Greens, and now they've got a problem versus independents. So
It's fires on multiple fronts to tackle.
Absolutely, yes, with the 30% primary.
I've often heard Anthony Albanese in sort of private musing say that he's relatively comfortable with where Labor's vote is at this point in the electoral cycle, that if we look at governments in the past that are somewhere in the order of 6 months out from a full term, they're often in a much worse position than Labor is now. Is that a fair assessment?
I would be cautious in trying to use history to predict what will happen in the future, because we are now living through a transformative period economically and politically. There were 5.2 million Australians that voted for something other than the major parties at the last election. We expect that number to grow. That comment is indicative of a culture that has not woken up to the new political reality, and that is that you are dealing with a far more fragmented electorate, much more savvy electorate, particularly amongst younger Australians who are willing to tactically vote, and a much more tribal electorate. So I think you should be staying awake at night and worrying about just how big that political front of his is.
Times are changing. Look, I did mention right at the beginning that Canberrans are also going to the polls with the ACT election this weekend. Things don't usually change all that much in Canberra, so I'm not sure if you get many calls for your services to survey in the field of the ACT. Do you have a sense of the voter sentiment in the nation's capital?
I think status quo. Yes, you are correct. We don't get many calls. I'll be looking at the independent vote, with David Pocock's presence. So I think at the come federal election, it will be interesting to see how his Senate vote performs. I would not rule out that he tops the ballot in that contest, because he's based on some of the more broader work that we've done. We are seeing that he's an incredibly popular political identity, and obviously his branding in the ACT will be extremely high. There are some independents associated with his brand standing, I suspect. So
yes, that's right. One of his former staffers, Tom Emerson, is running and has had a prominent role in this campaign, but the Hare Clarke system doesn't make it easy, that's for sure.
Right, correct,
yeah.
And that's the son of Craig Emerson.
Yes. And just to show politics is a small world.
Correct.
All right, Cos, Tony, it's always wonderful to have your insights. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Thanks, Mel.
If you have any thoughts, feedback, responses you want to send to us, you can email us at insiders@abc.net.au. We always like to hear from you. And there'll be more discussion about this on the Insiders Couch on Sunday morning with David Speers. Make sure you don't miss it.